The invitation arrived not as a digital notification, but as a physical weight, a thick, cream-colored card that felt more like a velvet-lined trap than an offer of employment. $2,000 for a single night of domestic oversight. It was the kind of figure that didn't just talk, it screamed over the mounting pile of past-due notices cluttering my kitchen table. As I pulled my rusted sedan into the gravel drive of the Blackwood estate, the contrast was immediate and suffocating. The mansion loomed against the twilight like a jagged obsidian tooth, its windows spilling a warm amber light that felt entirely unearned by the cold, scentless air of the surrounding woods. I was met at the foyer by a man impeccably dressed in a suit the color of bone, his expression as static and inanimate as the marble statues lining the hall. He didn't speak, he simply handed me a leather-bound folio titled The Protocols of Residence. Inside were the 12 rules, printed in black type so sharp it looked like it had been etched with a needle. Rule 1 was underlined twice. You always give back what you take out. The foyer smelled of expensive beeswax and something faint, something metallic, the sharp copper tang of a penny held too long in a sweaty palm. It was a sensory dissonance I couldn't ignore. The visual splendor of the crystal chandeliers and the gold leaf molding seemed to be masking a structural rot I could feel in my teeth. The man beckoned me toward the nursery wing, his movement a light scuffing of flesh across the polished floor. I clutched the rules to my chest, my heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had crossed the threshold for the money, but as the heavy double doors groaned shut behind me, I realized the price of admission had already been paid. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vane, stood at the base of the grand staircase, a pair of porcelain dolls carved from old money and unsettling silence. Mrs. Vane was draped in silk the color of a bruised plum, her throat cinched by a choker of pearls so white they looked like a row of polished teeth. She didn't smile, she simply appraised me with eyes that held the cold, flat sheen of a frozen lake. Mr. Vane stood a half step behind her, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back as if he were hiding a tremor or a weapon. They were the epitome of the elite patrons I had studied, people who viewed the world as a gallery and everyone else as a medium to be manipulated. "The child is particular," Mrs. Vane said, her voice a low, melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the back of my skull. "He requires a very specific frequency of attention. Do not deviate from the list." She gestured toward the leather folio I clutched. I felt a sudden, sharp urge to drop the book and run back to the safety of my mounting bills. But then Mr. Vane produced an envelope from his breast pocket. He fanned it open just enough for me to see the crisp, clean edges of 20 $100 bills. It was a visual lure, a siren song of financial salvation that effectively muted my survival instinct. "We shall return at dawn," he stated, his tone final. "Until then, the house is your jurisdiction, except for the cellar. Rule 12, remember." They turned in unison, their exit as synchronized and bloodless as a funeral procession. As the heavy front door clicked shut, the silence of the house expanded, thick and heavy. I looked down at the rules again. Rule 2, never let the hallway lights dim below 50%. I reached for the brass dimmer switch, but as my fingers touched the cold metal, the smell of dead flowers and decay, the same rot mentioned in the darker accounts of this neighborhood, began to seep from beneath the nursery door. The precautionary preamble was over. I was no longer a guest, but a participant in a transaction I didn't yet understand. The digital clock on the mahogany mantel clicked to midnight, a sound like a bone snapping in a quiet room. Rule 5 was explicit. At the stroke of 12, the nourishment must be administered, regardless of any auditory resistance. I approached the nursery door, the leather folio slick with the cold sweat from my palms. As I pushed the heavy oak panel open, the air didn't just change, it curdled. The previously faint scent of dead flowers erupted into a full-scale biological assault, a thick, cloying miasma of rotting lilies and sour milk that seemed to coat the back of my throat in a greasy film. The room was bathed in a rhythmic, pulsing violet light that made the shadows dance with a sickening liquid grace. In the center of the room sat a bassinet carved from what looked like red monoliths of crimson rock, its surface textured like dark, weathered sinew. There was no crying, only a low, rhythmic, wet thumping sound. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I pulled back the silk shroud to reveal the occupant. It was not a child. It was an anatomical impossibility, a small, pale form wrapped in gauzy white, its skin so translucent I could see the black fluid welling beneath the surface like ink in a vein. The nourishment sat on the bedside table, a silver chalice filled with a substance that looked like a foul obsidian milkshake. As I lifted the vessel, the creature's mouth opened, not to scream, but to reveal a cavity of endless, lightless depth. My gore rose, a hot surge of bile hitting my tongue, but the rule echoed in my mind with the force of a physical blow. You always give back what you take out. I tipped the chalice. The liquid didn't pour. It slithered into the dark opening, and as it did, I felt a sharp, phantom pain in my own soul, as if a vacuum seal had been applied to my very soul. The violation was complete, the sensory rot now a part of my own internal architecture. The violet light in the nursery had intensified into a thick, electric haze, turning the air into a medium that felt like swimming through cold oil. Rule 9 was no longer a suggestion. When the child begins to hum, the caretaker must offer the palm. I stood frozen as the anatomical horror in the crimson bassinet elongated, its gauzy wrappings falling away to reveal limbs that were far too long and jointed like a spider's. The humming wasn't vocal, it was a sub-harmonic vibration that rattled my molars and made the very marrow in my bones ache with a cold, hollow dread. My hand moved as if tethered to invisible wires, a physical compulsion overriding my frantic internal screams. I reached into the lightless void of the bassinet, my skin crawling as the temperature plummeted to a biting Arctic frost. There were no teeth, but the violation was far worse. A rough, dry tongue textured like sun-bleached sandpaper lapped once on the center of my palm. It didn't just touch me, it tasted the history of my blood, the chemical trace of my fear, and the desperate, struggling pulse of my future. The sensation was an agonizing paradox of fire and ice, a visceral harvesting that left me gasping, my knees buckling against the velvet rug. I felt the $2,100 in my pocket grow heavy, as if the gold was absorbing the weight of my stolen vitality. The creature retracted into the shadows, a wet scuffing sound marking its retreat, and the violet light flickered out, leaving me in a darkness so absolute it felt like a burial. The payment had been extracted, and as the copper taste of my own terror filled my mouth, I realized the rules weren't designed to protect the sitter, but to facilitate the feeding. The first gray slivers of dawn pierced the nursery's heavy velvet curtains, cutting through the stagnant air like surgical scalpels. The oppressive violet haze had retreated, leaving behind only the cold, clinical reality of a room that had witnessed an unspeakable harvest. I stood by the bassinet, my legs trembling, my palms still throbbing with the phantom heat of that sandpaper tongue. When the front doors finally groaned open, the sound was a reprieve that felt like an execution. Mr. and Mrs. Vane entered the foyer, their expressions as impeccably blank as the white marble floor beneath them. Mrs. Vane reached out, her fingers like cold ivory as she took the leather folio from my numb grasp. I didn't say a word as I walked past them, my footsteps echoing with a hollow, metallic ring that hadn't been there.